Okay, thanks everyone. We appreciate your flexibility and patience. It's really great to see so many people here. It's wonderful to have a big turnout like this. For those of you who don't know me, I am Josh Glasgow. I'm the director of the Center for Ethics, Law, and Society here at SSU. And one of the privileges of that title is that I get to invite amazing people to come speak at Sonoma State. And this event is a joint production of the Center for Ethics, Law, and Society, and we also should thank the Philosophy Club as a co-sponsor. And if any of you are interested, the Philosophy Club is meeting tomorrow at noon in Carson 56, if you're interested in this kind of stuff. So today's speaker is Paula Moya. Professor Moya is at Stanford University, where she is Associate Professor of English and the Director of the program in Modern Thought and Literature. She's quite prolific. Her earlier book was entitled Learning from Experience, Minority Identities, Multicultural Struggles. She has several edited collections, including Doing Race, 21 Essays for the 21st Century, and Identity Politics Reconsidered. And keep your eye on your local bookstores. Her latest book, The Social Imperative, Race, Close Reading, and Contemporary Literary Criticism, will be coming out later this year from Stanford University Press, and I think we're going to get a sample of that today. And some of you will have read her work on Latino identity, so we're really privileged to have Professor Moya here. She's the recipient also of a number of awards, including the Dean's Award for Distinguished Teaching, a Ford Foundation Postdoctoral Fellowship, Outstanding Chicano Faculty Member Award, a Brown Faculty Fellowship, and a Clayman Institute Fellowship. And today she'll be delivering a talk entitled Reading Race from Ferguson, Missouri to Morrison's A Mercy and Back Again. So please join me in welcoming Paula Moya.
Thank you, Josh. I really appreciate the invitation. I'm very glad to be able to come, to be able to spend some time with you. And I want to thank all of you as well for taking the time out of your day to come and be in conversation with me about some of these issues. I hope that we can have a little bit of time afterward to discuss some of the issues that are raised in the talk. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started. In a November 2014 article about Darren Wilson's testimony to the St. Louis County Grand Jury, Slate.com reporter Jamel Bowie details the way Wilson described the unarmed Black teenager he shot and killed. Now, Bowie, the reporter, recapitulates the sequence of events as narrated by Wilson, and he pulls out selected quotes to show that the officer perceived Brown to be a threat to his own safety. Now, what emerges from Wilson's description is an image of a brutish, menacing, aggressive, and Hulk-like superhuman Black man. Now, Bowie grants that Wilson's account of what happened fits the facts of the case. He notes that it is, in fact, consistent with forensic evidence and with eyewitness testimony. But, he says, the fact that it's possible doesn't make it believable, and looking at the story, I think it's ludicrous. Okay, so Bowie's judgment that the story is ludicrous is meant, of course, to cast doubt on the truth of Wilson's testimony regarding the sequence of events, right, what actually happened. But he also wants to call into question the referential accuracy of Wilson's perception of Brown. Now, he doesn't think that Wilson is lying about the way he perceived Brown, but he points out that Wilson perceives Brown through the schema of the Black brute, which was a stock figure of white supremacist rhetoric in the lynching era of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, this schema, the schema of the Black brute, figures Black men as menacing, powerful creatures with superhuman capacity for violence and physical endurance. And this schema not only justified the lynching of Black men during this turn of the 20th century, but it also provided fuel for the rising eugenics movement, which really flourished up until it lost legitimacy after the Holocaust during World War II. Now, the refusal then by the grand jury to indict Darren Wilson for the killing of the unarmed teenager Michael Brown, the acquittal of George Zimmerman for the killing of Trayvon Martin, the failure to indict Daniel Pantaleo for the chokehold death of Eric Garner, and the gunning down in a park of a 12-year-old Tamir Rice by an officer who had been previously judged unfit, not to mention the subsequent shackling of Tamir's 14-year-old sister when she ran to try to render her baby brother aid. These incidents have galvanized Blacks, other people of color, and their white allies in a manner that has brought to light countless other cases of brutality toward men, women, and children of color. And while it is highly unlikely that police have become more brutal of late, or that whites as a demographic group, and I mean this seriously, whites as a demographic group, not individual whites, but it's unlikely that whites as a demographic group have become more racist than they used to be. What is clear is that people of color, and especially African Americans, are not willing to accept this state of being anymore. From freeway shutdowns in Berkeley and Los Angeles, to die-ins at New York City Hall and Grand Central Station, from the blocking of traffic in Palo Alto and the shutdown of the San Mateo Bridge on Martin Luther King Day, to the reading of names of slain African Americans to bothered white brunchers in New York City, protesters enraged by a disregard for the value of Black lives have sought to interrupt business as usual. While at one time, a majority of whites might have been able to look away and ignore the suffering caused by racism to people of color, today they are finding it much harder to do so. Now, all of this has made painfully evident to some and has actually brought to the attention of others what scholars of race and ethnicity have known for some time, that people associated with different races employ divergent schemas to interpret their world. The point I want to make is that we don't just see race, we also read it, actively engaging in interpretive practices that draw upon widely available schemas that attribute particular meanings to different bodies, behaviors, styles, and places. As Wilson's testimony about Brown indicates, racist schemas motivate bad choices, as in, I have to shoot, and are also recruited afterwards to justify consequential behaviors. I feared for my life, and so I had to shoot. Now, the concept itself, schema, is one that I am taking from social psychology. Now, in social psychology, and as I mean to use the term, schema refers to the active organization of past experiences, so past experiences both physical and emotional, and past reactions, so sensory motor, moving, and cognitive affective, through which a person apprehends and interacts with incoming stimuli. As structures that have been built up through a person's past behavior and experiences in specific domains, schemas serve as patterns for one's current and future behavior in both that and in perceptually related domains. They are central to cognition insofar as they allow us to go beyond the information given, to fill in the gaps, or to extrapolate from what is known, from what one knows or from what is given to what might be apparent or might not yet have appeared. So to go beyond that information. Schemas thus have a temporal dimension characterized by evolution across time. That is, they are anticipatory as well as retrospective, even as they orient a person's behavior in the present. Now, there's a substantial body of experimental psychological research that supports the existence and functioning of schemas. The term was first applied to psychological phenomena in 1920 by English neurologist Henry Head. Subsequently, the English psychologist Frederick Bartlett used it to refer to cognitive processes and the overt actions involved in the organization of past experiences for the purposes of understanding and recall. The concept was also central to the developmental psychologist Jean Piaget, who used it to help explain the way children develop their cognitive skills. My point is that over the past century, many different psychologists have elaborated the concept of schema by demonstrating empirically that the activation of schemas derived from past experience is fundamental to people's ability to organize information coherently enough to perceive and remember. So now, in the service of showing how schemas work to direct attention, condition perception, and shape interpretation, I'm going to start with a short exercise to illustrate the importance of attending carefully to a specific aspect of a text. Now, the text in this case is going to be a video, so I'll direct your attention over here. And there's sound to this, but there's also words, so you can just read the words because I don't think we have the sound working right now. Now, I just want to point out that in this video that you're about to see, there are two teams of players. One team is going to be wearing black. The other team is going to be wearing white. And what I want you to do as you're watching this video is please pay careful attention and count the number of times that the players wearing white pass the ball. Okay, ready?
Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes.
So, how many got the correct number of passes? Okay. Did you see the gorilla? Who didn't see the gorilla? Okay. All right. So, I'm glad that a few of you are brave enough to admit that you didn't see the gorilla. That for most people who haven't seen this before, about half missed the gorilla. Okay. So now, for those of you who missed it, what happened is that I activated for you a ball passing schema. Because you were attending carefully to the ball passing, you missed something else that was going on, something that in retrospect is completely obvious. So the activity of directing your attention to a particular feature of the environment is what is called in social psychology priming. So if I had told you to watch for the gorilla, if I had given you a gorilla prime, then you would have certainly seen the gorilla. But you probably would not have been able to count the number of passes that either team made. So how many of you maybe have seen this particular experiment before? Okay, well, so a lot of you. This is why a lot of you saw the gorilla. Did you notice anything else? What did you see? Good for you. Very good. Anything else? What did you see? Very good. Now, had you seen this before?
I've seen the gorilla one, so I was looking for something different.
Very good. Very good. Yeah. So for many of you then wouldn't have seen the curtain change color, right? Or most of you would have missed that one of the players wearing black missed the game, left the game. So let me show that to you again.
Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events.
So now this video is actually an updating this video was in 2010 of an original video from 1999 by psychologists Christopher Chabris and Daniel Simons. Now, the two of them have done a number of studies illustrating the basic point that people often fail to see what is right in front of them. The point is that there will always be more stimuli in your environment than you can possibly apprehend. For this reason, perception is not a matter of simply looking out on the world and seeing what is there. Rather, perception is about filtering the barrage of incoming stimuli so that some small part of it can be observed. Now, before I go any further, I want to emphasize two really important things about schemas. So first, schemas are self-relevant, and the second is that they are learned. So because the fundamental units of the self system, right, the fundamental units, the core conceptions are predicated on significant interpersonal relationships, a person's set of schemas develop and evolve over the course of his or her life in conjunction with her identity as a being in a world full of other beings. Accordingly, the set of schemas any person possesses will be constituted by her bodies of knowledge, her collection of ignorances, her socio-cultural biases, and her dispositional attitudes toward learning about new and different situations. Many, if not most, of a person's schemas will be shared with others who are similarly situated within a particular society. So, for instance, if you're Latina, you might share a lot of your schemas with other Latinos. Or if you're Black, you might see the world in a way that a lot of other Black people see it. But other schemas will be particular to the person. They'll be particular to you, and they're going to be shaped by your idiosyncratic likes and dislikes. Like maybe you really like cars, or maybe you just got pregnant, and so all of a sudden you see pregnant women all over the place. This is what I mean by activating a schema. Now, as a literary critic, what interests me is understanding how schemas work in literature, and also how they in turn affect the way literature works. Now, of course, different readers bring different sets of schemas with them to the reading experience, but schemas are also embedded into works of literature. So they direct a reader's attention, they condition her perception, and then they shape the resulting interpretation. Now, insofar as literature is, and this is the way I understand it, as a system of social communication through which information, ideas, and norms are transmitted from author to reader and among communities of readers, it matters not only what literature we teach, but also how we teach it. So in the book that I just finished, that Josh, Professor Glasgow, was so kind to reference, I focus on those works of literature that interrupt business as usual. Now, I begin from the premise that the authors whose works I'm working on are astute cultural critics whose fictional works are extended and theoretically sophisticated meditations on and inquiries into race, ethnicity as a system of social distinction. I then argue that those authors use a variety of methods to highlight the social constructedness, right, the doing of race and ethnicity. So authors like Toni Morrison or Junot Díaz, for example, explicitly thematize the way that people read race onto the bodies of others. So the way that, for instance, Darren Wilson would have been reading race onto Michael Brown's body with certain ideas about what that meant. But they also facilitate, through the use of metaphors, motifs, intertextual allusions, and actual narrative structures, the development of alternative racial schemas. Like, how can we see Michael Brown in a different way? And these alternative racial schemas have a more referentially accurate relationship to the social world than those that usually circulate broadly in public discourse. As such, these authors are directly engaged in challenging the dominant narratives of white supremacy in this country, both in the themes that they choose and through the formal features of their works. They help readers to see, if you will, the gorilla, that is, the doing of race. Consider, for example, the title of Junot Díaz's short story, How to Date a Brown Girl, Black Girl, White Girl, or Halfie. How many of you have read this story? Anybody? It's worth, yeah, okay, I see at least a couple. It's definitely worth reading. Now, the reader who approaches this story without reading it through the intersecting lenses of race, gender, and sexuality would be perverse indeed. In suggesting that the story will take the form of a set of guidelines for how to date a girl, the title makes a direct second-person address to the reader, who is, after all, the putative recipient of the proffered advice. Like Althusser's policeman who subjects the passing pedestrian to the authority of the state by calling out to him, so does the title of this story hail the reader as learner, thus seeking to interpolate her into its system of racial understanding. The title further informs us that the girl will be a type, a racial type. Now, through its proliferation of female racial types who are apparently available to be dated, it nixes the notion that there might be a generic, that is, non-racialized ideal called girl. Finally, the title invokes the commonly accepted but less commonly acknowledged practice of treating people differently according to the race, gender, class, and sexuality with which they are associated. All of this before you even begin to read the story itself. Now, the story itself does many things, of course, but as this one example makes clear, first lines, epigraphs, and titles of either short stories in this case or in novels, chapters in novels, are key tools that authors use to prime the readers who approach their texts. Such primes are meant to capture the reader's attention, condition her perception, and shape the resulting interpretation. How many of you would read the story after this title? Yeah, there you go. And you would have to read it in terms of race and gender, you know, because that's what it's telling you to do. So I'm going to turn now to my second example, which is Toni Morrison's A Mercy. In A Mercy, how many of you have had a chance to read that novel? Okay, more of you should take a look at it. It's a quite wonderful novel. In that novel, she's grappling with two phenomena that are normally perceived as distinct, but which she represents as being fundamentally intertwined. Race as a system of social classification, on the one hand, and the ethics and activities involved with reading texts, including but not limited to the text of the racial other. Now, at stake in Morrison's exploration of race in A Mercy is her attempt to do with race what she did with slavery in her magnum opus, Beloved. So what she wants to do is break race open, to examine its origins, and find out what it does to its victims as well as to those who benefit from its operations. Accordingly, she looks to a time and a place in which the color-coded racial schemas that U.S. Americans now perceive as natural were just coming into being. Okay, so what she does is she chose the setting of A Mercy to facilitate her meditations about the origins of race and racism. So in an interview about the writing of the novel, Morrison explains what motivated her choice of time period. So she set this in colonial America, in other words. She says, I was looking for a time before slavery and black became married, before racism became established, but when slavery was the most common experience of most people. So what she does then is she goes back to the beginning of our country to imagine what it might have been like, and also to rewrite the narrative that we now have about the beginnings of this country. She says, dividing the world up ethnically or racially was a deliberate and sustained event that grew. But before that, I just wanted to suggest what it could have been like, what it might have been like before the narrative that we now have about the beginnings of this country. Okay, so what might be gained by looking back to a time before race? Okay, so we imagine that we just always looked out and saw each other as racialized beings. In fact, that's not the case. And what's the point of going back to that time? Well, the possibility, I think, that we might be able to envision a future beyond it. So the events of the novel take place over a period of about 8 years, from 1682 to 1690, in the American colonies of Virginia, Maryland, and what is most likely present-day New York. The novel, then, is set at a historical moment before Blackness and slavery were indissolubly linked. Slavery is something that has been part of human history forever, but it hasn't always been linked to Blackness. But in a geographic and economic setting where this linkage was just coming into being. Now, the difficulty and urgency of learning to read well is communicated in the first opening lines. So the novel, the opening lines is the first sentence, "Don't be afraid." Okay, so this is an injunction that positions you as the reader, as the recipient of an urgent communication. Now, the sense that you get in reading this is of having blundered onto some obscure but very pointed message. And it's reinforced a few sentences later when the second-person narrator hails us with an observation that borders on an accusation. You know. I know you know. The insistence with which the narrator asserts our prior knowledge implicates us in our role as reader while highlighting the question of responsibility for the resulting interpretation. So this twinned preoccupation between reading and responsibility surfaces again in the two questions around which a mercy is structured. One question is, who is responsible? And another is, can you read? Now, according to the logic of the novel, learning to read well indicates and transcends the usual capacity to decipher alphabetic text. Immediately after asking us if we can read, the narrator, who we later on find out is the slave girl Florence, informs us, if a peahen refuses to brood, I read it quickly. And sure enough, that night I see Mai standing hand in hand with her little boy, my shoes jamming the pocket of her apron. Now, the novel's first mention of reading thus references a sign that Florence interprets as indicating that she's going to dream that night about being abandoned by her mother. Now, later on in the novel, we find out that Florence can read alphabetic script. So it's noteworthy that her first reference to reading is the activity of reading refers outward to an animist world shot through with meaning. Now, notice that the question that is posed to us by the novel is not, can you see, but can you read? Therefore, reading rather than seeing is the operative metaphor in the novel for the processes involved in interpretation and understanding. And what I want to suggest to you is that this distinction is crucial because it belies the idea that we merely look out and see the world, quote, as it really is, while also pointing to the whole range of activities involved in arriving at any interpretation of any situation. Distinguishing reading from seeing in this way clearly foregrounds interpretation as a learned practice that depends on a reader's culturally competent grasp of socially situated conventions and codes across a range of both human and non-human interactions. It's not incidental that the entire plot of the novel turns on a misunderstanding. That is, Florence's misreading of a text that is social rather than alphabetic, namely the social text of the crucial encounter in which her mother offered her to her future master, the Dutch-English trader Jacob Vark. Now, by figuring interpretation as reading rather than seeing, Morrison stages an implicit critique of a naturalist or essentialist or a biological conception of race. So that race, as it emerges over the course of the novel, is not a thing that inheres in a person's body or blood. Rather, it is a way of reading human others for the purpose of deciding how we're going to interact with them. So I want you to think again about Darren Wilson looking out and reading Michael Brown and deciding how to interact with him. We do not look out and naturally see race. We read it onto the body of the other. Now, interpretation in a mercy is not merely a thematic concern. It's not just something Morrison is writing about. It's also a formal one, as demonstrated by the novel's character system and its anomalous distribution of narrative perspective and character space. So, the protagonist of this novel is a young slave woman named Florence, born in 1682 in Maryland as a result of a gang rape that had been orchestrated to break as well as to mate her enslaved West African mother. Florence neither knows nor misses her father. Besides Florence, there are 7 major characters. They include Jacob Vark, who's an Anglo-Dutch trader who owns the farm, all the goods, and all the people on, most people on it. Lena, who's a Native American slave owned by Jacob Vark. Rebecca Vark, who is a lower-class English-born wife of Jacob Vark. Sorrow, who's a mixed-race servant to Jacob Vark. Willard and Scully, who are 2 indentured European servants. And Mignon Mai, who is Florence's enslaved West African mother. Now, what I want to suggest is these are major rather than minor characters, and I'll tell you why. They each take a turn orienting the narrative. Beyond that, the images, metaphors, and narratives of the chapter that each one orients conform to that different focalizer's schemas, such that the reader sees the world through their eyes. Okay, so I want to give you a graphic of what that looks like. So the narrator of the first chapter, you see that first one, is the protagonist, Florence, speaking in the first person. She is also the character who orients the narrative. So what I mean by that is that she provides the schemas through which the events of that chapter are presented. In literary critical terms, any of you literary critics here? Okay, well, thank you. There's one back there. What she's doing is she's focalizing the narrative. Now, later on, we find out that Florence is writing the text we are reading and that the intended recipient of her communique is Blacksmith. Okay, so that's the first chapter. The second chapter has a third-person narrator, but the person who is orienting that narrative, who's focalizing that narrative, is Jacob Vark. So what that means is that the perceptions, the judgments, the attitudes, as well as the metaphors and all the stories contained within the Vark chapter are attributable primarily to him. So what does this mean? Okay, so there are people of Roman Catholic faith in this novel, okay, and throughout the novel, they are not necessarily represented as papists, but since that's how Jacob thinks about them, in his chapter, that's how they're represented. Together, the first 2 chapters set the general pattern followed throughout the rest of the narrative. Every odd chapter features Florence's second-person narrative voice writing to Blacksmith, and then they are interspersed, as you can sort of see here. The colors aren't great, but you can see the green ones are Florence, and the others are these different characters speaking in the third person. Now, as with the Vark chapter, the focalizer of each even chapter supplies the attitudes, perception, judgments, metaphors in that chapter. There's only one character besides Florence who both narrates and focalizes or provides the schemas for that chapter, and that is Florence's mother, and she has the last chapter. Now, what an examination of this narrative structure shows is that there is a mismatch between the power that Jacob Vark has as a member of colonial society and the power that Florence has as the primary teller of this tale. At the level of the story, right, what's happening, Jacob brings together all the different characters that populate the novel. He's the only character with the social and the economic power to pull the motley assortment of people together toward him and to compel them to do his will. Now, he possesses this power not because he is the smartest or the strongest character in the novel, although he is actually a strong and smart character, but because he is the only character who is backed up by the strength of the emerging social, legal, and economic institutions that are represented in the novel and that were part of colonial America. Jacob, then, is relatively powerful in the fictional society represented in A Mercy. His interpretive perspective, the schemas that he provides to us, therefore are the hegemonic ones. Florence, by contrast, is weak and unimportant from the perspective of those in her society who wield power. But because Morrison provides her with nearly half the narrative space, and because she is the only one of two characters to speak in the first person, Florence is the most powerful character at the level of novelistic discourse. My point in highlighting this disjuncture between the relative power that Jacob and Florence each have on the story level versus the discourse level is to suggest that were it not for Morrison's aesthetic choices, Florence's would remain the untold tale. By giving so much of the character space to Florence, Morrison's is troubling by calling attention to the power structure that would have existed in colonial American society. So rather than reflecting the actual structures of inequitable distribution, as was the case, for instance, in the 19th century bourgeois novel, like how many of you have read, say, Pride and Prejudice, right? So if you read that, the narrative structure of a novel like that actually reflects the inequitable distribution of power, whereas this, I'm suggesting, is working against that. So Morrison's narrative structure enacts a redistribution of narrative space, one that attempts to redress the imbalance of power accorded to them, to Jacob and Florence, by the fictional society in which they live. She actually then creates a narrative form that interrupts business as usual. Moreover, by illuminating the multiple and intersecting worldly contexts that provide the content for human consciousness, Morrison reminds us that consciousness presupposes a sociality, a set of values, characteristic ways of interacting, and actual particular persons who inhabit specific geographical and psychic spaces. Differently than Diaz in How to Date, but with similar goals, Morrison therefore elucidates, deepens, and extends the DuBoisian notion of double consciousness. As she does so, she moves her readers away from the us-them binaries, which are too often figured in terms of black-white, male-female, worker-capitalist, right? She moves us away from those binaries toward the recognition of the multiplicity of worlds of sense, different ways of understanding and inhabiting our world. Now, literature, the point that I want to end with here today is that literature builds for us schemas through which we interpret the world. Literatures are obviously not the only thing that does this. Movies do this for us. We go to movies, we see images, they provide for us the schemas through which we see the world. But what I want to point out here is that literature also does that for us. It has the effect of altering our perceptions. It teaches us how to interpret unfamiliar phenomena. Literature makes us think, but it also makes us feel. It gives us language, but it also prompts us to form images in the mind that evoke for us a whole variety of association. It therefore engages us at a cognitive affective level and is an important tool as well as a powerful actor in a struggle to create what I would call racial literacy. This is why, as a literary critic and as a teacher, I have come to really understand that it matters not only what we teach, right, what we give to our students, but also very much how we teach it. And I'll stop there.